Hi friends, Krista here. Thanks for stopping by Books and Jams. Today I'm going to talk about all the books that I read in the second half of the month of November. I read quite a lot in November. I think overall it's 18 or 17 books. I talked about 7 of them in my mid-month wrap-up, which I will link down below if you missed that. Some of those I've unhauled or added to my Pango shop. Some of those have had to be returned to the library. So I'm not going to go through the list of the books that I already talked about, but I do have 11 more books to talk about with you right now. So we are just going to jump right in. I'm going to start with 2 graphic novels that I read in the month of November. Both of them are by Matt Phelan. I read The Shadow in the Barn and Bluffton. Both of these are historical graphic novels. The Storm in the Barn takes place during the Dust Bowl time period, 1937 Kansas, and this family who's really struggling and this boy who's just not connecting with his dad and he really wants to, but it's a tough time and the dad is really frustrated and anxious, and some of their neighbors had left to go to California and the boy thinks he sees some kind of a creature in the barn. There's this kind of a legend of thunder and rain, and it's all kind of interconnected. It was interesting, very bleak, as I'm sure it really just was at that time, but the drawings even themselves are pretty sparse, which I thought was interesting way to illustrate this type of a book. I gave it 3 stars. I didn't love it, but I was interested all the way through. And a graphic novel is a nice palate cleanser for me. It's just to kind of sit down in one sitting and read the whole story. And I did that with this one. So Shadow in the Storm in the Barn by Matt Phelan. The other one that I read by him is Bluffton. This one takes place even further ago in 1908 in Michigan. Bluffton is kind of near Muskegon, Michigan. I'm not even sure if I'm saying that, Muskegon. And it follows a group of vaudeville players, actors, creative people who come to Bluffton, Michigan every summer. One of the boys who's from the town in Michigan befriends Buster Keaton, who is one of the vaudeville kids. The Keaton family has an act in the vaudeville show. And so we just kind of learn about, we just kind of see these vaudeville players come to town every summer. The boys' friendship, struggle with having a crush on the same girl type of a thing. It has the same kind of drawing style as the other one, but a little bit more colorful, which is appropriate. It's summertime and it's a lot more lush. It matches the story as well. I also gave this one 3 stars. I just kind of randomly found both of these at the library when I was there with my little dude a couple weeks ago, and so I just thought I would read them. So that's 2 graphic novels that are kind of historical in nature, which is appropriate for Historathon that happened in November. For the rest of my books, I'm going to go from my least favorite to my favorite. So I will end on a high note, but we will start with a not so high note. Unfortunately, I did not really love Gift from the Sea by Anne Morrow Lindbergh. I know a lot of people have really liked this. It's a collection of essays by Anne Morrow Lindbergh set at the beach. She kind of gathers some seashells and then makes some connections between these shells and real life. It was not for me. I thought that there were a few things that were kind of poignant in there, but overall, I just didn't really care for it at all, honestly. I was bored. This little tiny book took me forever to read because I just never wanted to pick it up. I gave it 2 stars. It was just okay. It was just okay. And I'm especially sad because someone sent that to me thinking that I would like it, and I just really didn't care for it. So another book that was a little bit of a disappointment, but I still liked it and gave it 3 stars, is Godmersham Park by Jill Hornby. This one I read for Historathon as well. It takes place in 1804, and we follow Anne Sharp, who is kind of disinherited by her father when her mother passes away, and she has to work for the first time in her life. So she becomes a governess to the Austens, Edward Austen and his wife, and for their children, and eventually gets to meet Henry Austen and Jane Austen and strike up a friendship with them. I had higher hopes for this one, but I did find things to really connect with, her being just being single and unexpected life circumstances. And I did appreciate the way that she connected with Fanny, the little girl that she was mainly in charge of, her education. I liked the way she viewed education and thought women should be greatly educated, and she was super smart. And there were definitely things about it that I really did like, but overall it was not quite as compelling as I wanted it to. It was more of a soft, sweet, quiet novel. And while that has its place, it's often not for me. So that's Godmersham Park by Jill Hornby. Another 3-star that I listened to on audio because the girls, Meredith and Katie on Currently Reading podcast, were raving about Comfort Me with Apples by Catherine M. Valente. I think even a group of Currently Reading Patreon people or patrons, which I am a part of, I think there was a group of them that did a buddy read of this one, and I did not join in for the buddy read, but I saw that the audiobook was only a few hours long, and so I'm like, one morning while I was just doing things around the house, I went ahead and listened to it, and it was a strange book for sure. It didn't blow my mind as much as they were talking about, or as much as I expected because of the way they were talking about it on the podcast. It did have some surprises for sure. I just think overall, I wasn't vibing with the feel of the book, but it was kind of fun to guess what was going on and try to figure out what was going on. It's hard to describe this one without giving anything away because you really don't want to know too much. But in it, we follow Sophie, who is married. Her husband is also often gone. And it seems like she lives in kind of a utopic society. Utopic? Is that how you would say it? Like a perfect society. People are always asking her if she's happy. But there were some weird things going on. And you kind of know, you get this feeling right from the beginning that things just aren't what they seem. And so it was kind of fun to try to figure out what was going on. And I did not figure out what was going on. But I think overall it just wasn't my type of book. Again, 3 stars. Fun read, but not as mind-blowing as others were talking about. The third 3-star read that I had this month was The Girl in His Shadow by Audrey Blake. I feel like this had a YA vibe to it. I'm not sure if it is YA. I gave it 3 stars. We follow a young woman, Nora, who is rescued by a doctor when she's very young. The rest of her family dies of cholera, and she is also sick, but he brings her back to his house practice, like both in the same building, and nurses her back to health along with his head housekeeper. And then she just kind of stays on as his ward because all of her family had passed away. So she grows up with this doctor and has a propensity towards sciences. So she learns right alongside of him. He lets her come into his surgery and watch and learn and practice. And she's very artistic. So she begins doing drawings for him for some of his medical journal articles. And yet she is not allowed to go to school at this time. When is it? Set during the Victorian age. So she's not really allowed to go to school in England at the time to become a doctor. And it would be very looked down upon. The doctor would be looked down upon and actually not more than just ridiculed, but he would be fined, potentially put in prison if it became known that she was working with him in his practice. Everything is going along just fine though, however, until the doctor brings on another young man as a mentor, as a mentee. And it's at the beginning of him being there, they have to be super cautious until they know how he is going to respond to Nora being there and being present. A couple situations come up where he recognizes and realizes her skill and ability and knowledge, and you just kind of see where things go from there. It does, at one point, I feel like it kind of switches and becomes more of a romance, and I was not thrilled about that. I think maybe that's why it got knocked down a couple stars, because I was more interested in her and the science aspect of things. Oh, and this is another one that was very medically graphic at the beginning. I just didn't need all the blood. Like, there was so much blood in describing some of these procedures and medical things that were going on at the beginning. I'm like, I just don't care. I don't care. Too much. It was too much. But I thought the story was interesting. I thought it was a good look at a female with science knowledge and like a love for science and medical things, and what she had to go through in order to reach her potential, possibly. So I did enjoy it, but there were just a couple things about it that kept it from being higher stars in my book. 3 stars. Moving into some 4-star reads, I picked up The Lost Girls of Willowbrook. This was the group read for Historathon this year. This is by Ellen Marie Weisman. In it, we follow Sage Winters, who had a twin, and when she was young, she was told that her twin passed away. And then when she's about 16, she learns that her twin actually did not pass away, but has been at Willowbrook School on Staten Island. They live on Staten Island. Oh, and she learns that not only was her sister at Willowbrook, but she's gone missing. So now Sage, without passing go, without stopping at all, like not talking to anybody, she just up and goes to Willowbrook and tries to track down her sister. However, her and her sister are identical twins, and when she shows up at Willowbrook, she is mistaken for her sister and put into this horrible situation at Willowbrook. I had watched the Geraldo Rivera expose on Willowbrook that was done in the 1970s. This takes place in the 70s as well. Early 70s, late 60s, I guess. I watched his expose before I read this book, and it's so harrowing. Oh my word. Some of those images I think will be in my mind for a really long time. And this book has its harrowing moments as well. I'm not going to say this was a perfect book by any means. There were some plot holes, big plot holes, things that you have to just kind of accept as it is. But this is a book that's a perfect example of me as a reader. I get so emotionally caught up with a story that I lose some of my ability to be critical about some of those storyline things because I'm just so caught up in the story itself. And I do think Ellen Marie Weisman is a good storyteller. This was very compelling. I was flying through the pages. I did not want to put it down. And when a book is like that, I can happily ignore, while I might recognize them, I can ignore some of those glaring plot points. But they're there. And if that's something that bothers you, I know that there were others who really didn't care for this book because of some of those plot holes and such. But also, along with this story of these twin sisters, there is an urban legend on Staten Island of this serial killer named Cropsey, who potentially had connections to Willowbrook, and that storyline was brought in as well. So I was not prepared when I was reading this for the thrillery aspects of this. There were parts that were really creepy and intense and had my heart racing. And I just wasn't prepared for that. I was prepared for the horrors of this institution, Willowbrook, that was grossly underfunded and understaffed, and the abuses that were going on there. I had prepared myself for that, but I was not prepared for the serial killer storyline and that kind of urban legend that was brought in as well. So, which was a true legend, or like that really happened. There was a serial killer on Staten Island that had connections to Willowbrook. So I didn't really know that. It was really interesting to learn about that. I really enjoyed this book. I gave it 4 stars. Again, it wasn't a perfect book. I recognize that there are plot holes, but I was here for it and I really enjoyed it. Another really difficult book that I gave 4 stars to was my Patreon book club book for the month of November. We read Indian Horse by Richard Wagamese. This is an Own Voices Canadian Indigenous story about a young man named Saul. And at the very beginning, we are with Saul and his family as they move around a little bit in the bush. In the bush? Is that what you call it? And we get to see, his family retreats into the woods because 2 of his siblings had been kidnapped to be brought to these Indian training schools, which if you've been aware of the news at all in the last couple of years, all of this has come to the light, how horrible these schools were. And they existed all the way up. I think the last one finally closed in the 80s or 90s, which is just insane to me how recent some of these things are coming to light. So Saul, in this story, right at the beginning, he's older and in rehab, and part of his therapy is to write, or is to tell his story, and he does that by writing. So this has a feel of a memoir all the way through. I felt like Saul was a real person, and I was reading about his life story, and I felt very connected to Saul. There were parts that were so emotional. Anyways, Saul also ends up at an Indian training school, and it's awful. Just some of the stories of the other kids that are there and things that happened to him while he was there. It's heartbreaking and infuriating at the same time. And then there's one priest who comes, a newer staff member to the school, and creates a hockey rink for the boys and starts a team of hockey for some of the boys at the school. And Saul gets involved with that, and it is something that provides him with a lot of escape, and he is really good at it and determined to learn it well, and he practices and practices. He is too young when they first start the hockey team, so he gets himself a job of cleaning the ice in the mornings and getting it ready for the older boys. And after he does that, he practices, and he just has a knack for the game and is able to see moves. And then we kind of follow his hockey career even after the school when he's able to get away. And hockey provides him an opportunity to play with a team of Indigenous young men. But then also they get a chance to play elsewhere as well. And because he's just so good, he has an opportunity to move up into different levels. But while there, it faces such prejudice, such horrible bullying and abuse, and eventually it turns to drinking. And it's just really difficult. It's so sad, but it's so well told. And there are moments, glimmers of light through this story. There was a couple things that happened that totally knocked me off my feet. I was crying. I was infuriated. I was so surprised. It's a tiny little novel, but it packs a big punch. And I feel like this is a book that has flown under the radar. I do believe there's an adaptation for it as well on one of the streaming services. I'm not ready to watch that yet. I may someday, but this is a book that's going to sit with me for a while. I would highly recommend reading that when you're in the right emotional state to read it, because it's a heavy one. The last 4-star book that I read in November was The Key to My Heart by Leah Lewis. This was a NetGalley book, and guys, it comes out on December 6th. I read it just before it comes out. I'm so excited. Today's December 4th, so it comes out 2 days from now. I'm not sure when this video is going up, but I am so thrilled that I actually read a NetGalley book before its release date. This is part of my NetGalley goal for the year, to get caught up enough, and I'm not caught up enough, but to get to the point where I am actually reading the books like I'm supposed to just before they come out so I can let you know about them. Well, here I am, shortly around release date, letting you know about The Key to My Heart by Leah Lewis. This is not a rom-com, as it may look like from the cover. It does have a romance in it, but Leah is a widow. She lost her husband 2.5 years prior to the events of this story, and is really, really struggling. In her mind, everyone around her expects her to just move on and move forward with life, and she just doesn't feel ready to move on. She's devastated by the loss of her husband, as I can imagine one would be, and just doesn't feel ready to move on. So she feels a little bit stuck. She's a musician, plays the piano, hasn't been able to play very much as her job by any means, but finds a piano in the train station. It takes place in London. She finds a piano in a train station, which is one of those pianos that, kind of sit around in public places where people can step up and play them. And she goes there to play, where she feels a little anonymous. She can reconnect with this part of herself, but not have any kind of pressure to do anything with it. But she begins playing the piano at this train station. Well, 3 or 4 pieces of sheet music get left for her on this piano that have significant meaning to her relationship with her husband. And so she is like, it puts a little spark in her, like, who is leaving this music? Is this something that is this something that Russ did to like help me? She just doesn't know what to make of it. There's a coffee shop in the train station. After she goes to play, she always goes to the same little coffee shop and becomes really good friends with the owner of the coffee shop. And we just kind of go from there. And the people that she meets and comes across. But I love, as I always say, books that talk about grief and books that have music in them. And this was a combination of those two things. I found the way Natalie was finally able to kind of open up herself again to people, to love, to friendships, the way that she was finally able to be honest with some of her friends. I loved a lot of the friends that she had in this book who stood by her even when she was just having a difficult time. I just really appreciated the friendships and the family relationships that were in this book. And I loved the music, and I loved the talk about grief, and I loved the romance that eventually came towards the end. It's, like I said, it's not a rom-com. There's a lot of there's a lot of heavy emotions in this one. This does not have any open door scenes, which I also really appreciated. And there's a romantic gesture towards the end that knocked my socks off, had me crying. I really did enjoy this book, and I gave it 4 stars. Finally, I have 2 more that are 5-star reads for the month. The first one I did talk about quite a bit in a reading vlog, a weekend reading vlog. I think actually I talked about both of these, but Yellow Wife by Sadika Johnson is another heavy duty book in which we follow Phoebe, who is the daughter of an enslaved woman and the master. So she is biracial. We kind of follow her difficulties in being caught in the middle, if you will. So her mother had a forced, I guess, relationship with the master of the house, and the mom always talked to him, and he had promised that when Phoebe turns 18, she would be given her freedom. However, the dad takes off for some trip, brings the mom along with him, and the wife, the master's wife, she's horrible to Phoebe. She knows that it's her husband's daughter, and she's brutal. She's brutal to her, and Phoebe ends up getting sold, and she ends up at this prison that is here in Richmond. So this is a local to me author. The events of this story take place right here in my city, and this jailer kind of takes Phoebe as his mistress, and she becomes the mistress of this jail, and she is forced to do things for her own survival and to help as best she can other people. I just found it to be a very unique take on a slave narrative. It was a tough one, but again, such a good storyteller. Sadika Johnson had me invested in this book right from the very get-go. I listened to the majority of it in one day because I did not want to stop. I gave it 5 stars. I thought it's an important read, but again, a very heavy and difficult one at times. Whew. And finally, the last book that I read was a nonfiction, I think. I guess Gift from the Sea was nonfiction. And this is the other nonfiction I read this month. Not as much nonfiction as I might have wanted to, but I did read The Library Book by Susan Orlean. I listened to this on audio and it was so good. I don't remember if I talked about this one already. Anyways, it's a fascinating look at the LA Central Library where there was a fire in the 1980s. And it never was figured out who started the fire and how the fire actually got started. So it's kind of a deep dive into that specific situation, but also the LA Library as a whole, as a system, and libraries even on a broader scale as a part of community and the impact that a library can have on a community. But we do take a look at the history of the LA Library and who's in charge and some of the choices that they made. But it's also just a love story about libraries as a whole and a true crime about this fire that happened in the 1980s. It's a little bit of something for everyone in this book. If you love your library, I would definitely recommend reading this one. I gave it 5 stars. I was fascinated. I thought it was so interesting. So here are the books that I read the second half of November, as well as 2 others that I don't have here. I would love to chat with you down in the comments below. How did your November reading go? I was flying through books this month, or last month, I guess. And I'm really pleased with some of the ones that I read. Got some off my shelves, but also read a lot of heavy kind of books in the month of November. So definitely was ready to start the Christmas reads once December hit. Let's chat down in the comments below. You guys know I always love talking with you down there. We could talk about the books I mentioned today, or one of your favorite reads from the month of November, or anything else that you want to talk about. I always love talking to you down there. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate you being here, truly, from the bottom of my heart. I love that you're here. I love that you push the like button. I love that you comment. I love that you just watch. And even if you never say anything, it means the world to me. And I look forward to talking with you in another video very soon. Bye.